the problem is the war. If we would integrate Ukraine into the European Union, we would integrate the war. And we would not like to be together in one community with the country.
A háború blokkolja az európai és a magyar gazdaság növekedését. 185 milliárd eurót öltek bele ebbe a reménytelen háborúba.
Today we continue our deep dive into the mounting crisis within the European Union, centered on the clash between Hungarian Prime Minister Viktor Orban and European Commission President Ursula von der Leyen, a showdown with consequences far beyond Budapest and Brussels. For months now, tensions have escalated on multiple fronts: funding for Ukraine, the future of EU solidarity, rule of law, and democracy, the very identity of what the EU stands for. Let's walk through what's going on and what might come next. Welcome back to EU Politics. If you're new here, hit that subscribe button and stay updated on Europe's shifting political landscape. The flashpoint right now is the war in Ukraine and Europe's challenge to sustain financial and military support as Kyiv braces for another harsh winter. Last week, 7 EU countries, including Estonia, Finland, Ireland, Lithuania, Latvia, Poland, and Sweden, urged Brussels to move swiftly on a proposal from the Commission to channel frozen Russian state assets as a reparations loan for Ukraine. Under the plan, the bloc would mobilize up to 90 billion euros over 2026 to 2027, roughly 2/3 of what Ukraine needs, either via interest income on immobilized Russian assets or through common EU borrowing, but there's resistance. The bulk of those frozen assets sit in a Belgian financial institution, and Brussels worries about bearing disproportionate legal and financial risk if Russia challenges the move legally. Belgium has repeatedly voiced its objections, and then there is Hungary. Orban's government has flatly rejected every version of the plan, whether joint EU borrowing, diverting domestic resources, or using frozen Russian assets. He labeled the scheme absurd, arguing it would undermine the entire global economic system and destabilize trust in foreign exchange management. That rejection complicates things deeply, because even if a majority of EU states support the reparations loan, Hungary's stance echoes a broader existential challenge to what the EU aims to do: how to maintain solidarity when national governments block collective action. But the conflict between Brussels and Budapest goes far beyond Ukraine and money. At the heart lies a fundamental struggle over values, democracy, rule of law, free media, civic space. In 2025, the European Parliament adopted a strong interim report condemning Hungary's persistent rule of law crisis. The report highlights a string of problems: judicial interference, chronic corruption, misuse of EU funds, political pressure on civil society, NGOs, and media, weakened checks and balances, and a shrinking space for dissent and free expression. Moreover, critics warn that a draft law recently proposed by the Hungarian government called Transparency of Public Life would allow the state to blacklist foreign-funded NGOs and media, freeze their funding, and effectively silence many independent voices under the guise of protecting national sovereignty. This proposed law is seen by many as part of a broader crackdown, a push to tighten control over civil society, just ahead of Hungary's national elections in 2026. In response, the Commission has warned that if the law passes, it would constitute a blatant violation of EU treaty principles, and has refused to rule out taking the matter to the European Court of Justice, ECJ. On top of that, Orban recently directly attacked von der Leyen, accusing her of corruption and publicly calling for her resignation. He blamed her for alleged failures: high energy prices, poor handling of migration and defense, and the EU's competitiveness in ruin. This confrontational stance is symbolic not just of political disagreement, but a challenge to the legitimacy and direction of EU leadership itself. Under Orban's view, Brussels has become a bureaucratic imperial elite, disconnected from what he frames as national interests and common sense. Meanwhile, von der Leyen and the Commission have responded by tightening conditionality, Under the new multi-year budget framework proposed in 2025, future EU funds to member states can be suspended if they deviate from democratic norms and values. In other words, EU financial support is no longer automatic. Access to funding increasingly depends on compliance with the rule of law, judicial independence, media freedom, and civil rights. That shift represents a decisive turn in EU policy. It shows Brussels is no longer merely making statements, it is trying to back values with concrete leverage. And Hungary stands at the front line of that battle. So what does this all mean for the EU and for Europe's future? First, the reparations loan battle reveals deep fractures in the Union when it comes to collective action. If the EU fails to mobilize urgent support for Ukraine because of internal vetoes or national resistance, it risks undermining its credibility both as a defender of European security and as a united geopolitical actor. Second, the rule of law showdown with Hungary threatens to shift the balance of power within the Union. If Brussels gains the ability to tie funds to democratic compliance and enforces it, it could reshape how the EU exercises influence over member states, giving more real power to institutions over national governments. Third, the situation in Hungary media crackdown, civil society repression, judiciary changes serves as a warning to other EU countries. Democratic erosion can start gradually under domestic legality, but still clash catastrophically with EU norms. For ordinary citizens across Europe, the stakes are more than political. This affects whether European taxpayers' money supports corruption or open societies, whether EU legal standards protect individual rights, whether European solidarity in moments of crisis remains real, and for the EU as a collective, the choices made now will determine whether the Union becomes stronger, more unified, and values-driven, or fragments under pressure from nationalist governments. What should you watch in the coming months? Whether at the upcoming EU summit, scheduled mid-December 2025, member states give final approval to the reparations loan plan for Ukraine, potentially overcoming Hungary's opposition through qualified majority voting, whether the draft Hungarian law on NGO media transparency becomes law, and whether the Commission or ECJ intervenes to halt it, whether new conditionality rules for EU funds trigger actual freezes or suspensions for Hungary or other countries if democratic standards continue to erode. How public opinion in Hungary and other EU member states responds, especially with national elections upcoming in 2026 in Hungary, and finally, whether the EU can redefine itself not only as a trading and regulatory bloc, but as a union grounded in shared democratic values, capable of enforcing those values when they are threatened. As always, this story is still unfolding. What happens next could decide the direction of not just Hungary, but the destiny of the European Union. If you want to stay ahead of the curve and get timely updates, don't forget to subscribe to EU Politics Now. Ring the bell, share this video if you found it useful, and comment below with your thoughts. Is the EU doing enough to defend its values? Or is it compromising too much for short-term unity? But before we wrap up, there's another angle worth understanding, an angle many analysts believe could define the next decade of European politics, and that is the growing ideological divide inside the EU itself. What we're witnessing isn't just a clash of policies between Orban and von der Leyen, it's a clash of visions for what the European Union is supposed to be. On one side, leaders like von der Leyen argue that Europe must be more integrated than ever. They believe global challenges from Russian aggression to climate change to AI and defense cannot be solved through fragmented national policies. These leaders want the EU to act like a unified geopolitical force, capable of making big, bold decisions quickly and collectively. On the other side, Orban and similar nationalist leaders insist that sovereignty must remain with individual nations. They argue that Brussels has become too powerful, too intrusive, too distant from ordinary people. To them, the EU should remain a loose alliance, not a centralized political engine capable of overruling national parliaments. This isn't just a temporary argument, it's a long-term ideological battle that could reshape treaties, budgets, foreign policy, migration rules, even the EU's future borders. And as this divide widens, the question becomes, Which side will the next generation of Europeans choose? One thing is certain, the story is far from over. And as this political storm intensifies, one question is being asked not only in Brussels, but in every European capital. How did we reach a point where a single member state has enough influence to shake the entire union? The answer lies in the EU's complex structure, a system built on unity, yet deeply dependent on consensus. For years, Orban has used this structure to challenge almost every major EU decision, from migration reforms to Russia sanctions. But this time, analysts say the stakes are far higher. Because this is not only about budgets or political disagreements, it is about whether the European Union can function effectively in moments of crisis. If one country can repeatedly veto or block decisions that affect the entire continent, can the EU truly act as a unified force? That's the debate echoing behind closed doors in Brussels. Some leaders argue that the time has come to reform EU treaties, removing veto powers on key issues such as foreign policy, defense, and security. And whatever happens next, the effects will ripple far beyond Brussels. So, if you want to stay ahead of every twist in this unfolding drama, make sure you subscribe to EU Politics right now because this story is only just beginning.